Deep in the Ural Mountains of Russia, there lies a desolate and unforgiving peak known to the indigenous Mansi population as Kholat Syakhl, which roughly translated means dead mountain. While the original reason for the name is unknown, the mountain would more than earn it when it played host to the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident. In the early months of 1959, 9 hikers embarked on an expedition into the Siberian wilderness. Despite their collective experience, none of them returned. They made temporary camp on the side of Dead Mountain. And more than 60 years later, investigators are still struggling to explain what happened. Welcome to Historian's Corner, where today we will discuss the mysterious deaths of the Dyatlov Nine. At the dawn of January 25, 1959, 10 trekkers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute arrived at the small mountain town of Ivdel in the former Soviet Union. The group, headed by Igor Dyatlov, consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all of whom were experienced hikers, skiers, and outdoorsmen. They subsequently boarded a truck to Vizhai, spent the night, and began their arduous journey on the morning of the 27th. However, by the second day, the journey had become too difficult to bear for one Yuri Yudin, who began to complain of severe joint pain. Yudin, despite being just 21 years of age, had been diagnosed with a number of pre-existing health conditions, which ultimately left him with no other choice but to turn back. No doubt he was devastated at the time that he could not persist on the hike with his friends. As it turns out, he was the lucky one. Following Yudin's departure, the remaining 9 expeditionists traversed on flat land for 4 additional days until they reached the base of the mountain on the final day of January. Dyatlov's initial route plan from that point forward, which he had filed with the Municipal Committee of Physical Activity and Sport, had the group reaching the peak of Otortyan by way of a mountain pass. But due to extreme weather conditions and low visibility on just their first day of climbing, the team ended up veering off course to the west, making it all the way to Dead Mountain before they finally realized they had lost their way. At this point, Dyatlov and his crew had a few options. Since they knew the area well, they could have reasonably chosen to descend to a lower altitude. This course would have probably decreased the severity of the weather conditions they were forced to endure, since they would have been able to take shelter in a nearby wood. Nonetheless, whether Dyatlov did not want to lose the ground he had gained, or simply wanted practice making camp in the more extreme conditions, the unit decided to pitch a tent and spend the night. That decision would ultimately be fatal, leading everyone in their party to perish before sunrise. When nothing had been heard from Dyatlov's group by February 12th, friends and colleagues back at the Institute began to voice concerns, and subsequently assembled a search and rescue group. Finding the makeshift campsite first, the team noticed almost immediately that something wasn't quite right. For one thing, the tent Dyatlov and his peers put up had been cut open from the inside, with much of their belongings, including clothing, left behind. There were multiple different trails of footprints leading from their escape hole and down the mountain slope, which the rescuers noted had left shallow, orderly imprints in the snow. This suggested that they had not left the campsite in a hurry, a scenario which would have resulted in deeper and more disorganized shoe prints. Following these tracks led the search party to the edge of a wood, and to the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivoshenko were found huddled around what appeared to have been a small campfire. Neither had sustained any wounds or injuries, and both were wearing nothing more than socks and undergarments, far less than they would have needed to survive in the slope's frigid conditions. Behind the 2 men was a large pine tree with several branches broken on the way up. Obviously, one or more of the hikers had tried to climb it, but why they had done so, the rescuers could not immediately discern. Had someone tried to reach higher ground in a futile attempt to relocate their campsite, or were they fleeing from an approaching predator? Some ways into the wood, 3 more bodies were located: Igor Dyatlov, Zenita Komogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. All had frozen at varying distances from the broken pine tree into positions indicating they were attempting to return to their campsite. Like their colleagues, these 3 were largely unharmed, except for Slobodin, who had a small crack in his skull that doctors later deemed to be non-fatal. These findings by the rescuers most certainly raised more questions than they answered. But perhaps the most significant enigma was what they did not find. Even after weeks of searching, the bodies of the remaining 4 hikers could not be uncovered. Or, more accurately, the final bodies would not be discovered until nearly 4 months later. Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Brignolis, and Semyon Zolotaryev were finally found on May 4th at the bottom of a ravine, buried under more than a dozen feet of snow. More signs of hypothermia were found at the scene, as most of these expeditionists were found without their requisite winter clothing. However, unlike the rest of the Dyatlov group, each body at this site was discovered with at least one gruesome injury. Rignolis had a crushed skull, and Dubinina and Zolotaryev had major chest injuries. So major, in fact, that one investigator compared them to injuries from a car crash. Dubinina and Zolotaryev were also found missing several facial features. Zolotaryev had empty eye sockets, and Dubinina had no eyes, tongue, or lips. Needless to say, this horrifying discovery shattered everyone's preconceived notions about the Dyatlov Pass incident. The conclusion of investigators following the first round of discoveries had been fairly straightforward. The party had died of hypothermia. Notwithstanding the mystery of why the party had left their tent in the first place, there was initially no evidence found that anyone had succumbed to any great force, be it malicious or natural. But as the final 4 hikers were unearthed, those assumptions went the way of the wind, leaving no obvious explanation in its place. By the time the search had ceased, and all the bodies had been evaluated, the official explanation for what had happened that fateful night in Dyatlov Pass was, well, not really an explanation. Rather, the report simply stated that a compelling natural force had been too much for the trekkers to overcome. In the decades that have followed, many researchers, unsatisfied with this vague non-answer, have posted their own theories. Many theories have been thrown around to explain the hikers' tragic deaths. Though it would undoubtedly make for a less compelling story, the majority of researchers have argued that the most banal explanation for what happened at Dyatlov Pass is also the most likely to have actually occurred. Namely, that a disturbance from inside their shelter caused the hikers to hastily abandon the tent in the middle of the night. Once they had escaped, they unfortunately found themselves underdressed and unprepared for the weather, leaving them with no other choice but to seek cover in the nearby wood. Their efforts fell short, and 5 of the 9 slowly perished due to hypothermia. But what about the other 4 expeditionists? Well, it's possible that this group triggered a minor avalanche while they were trying to make their way back to camp, knocking them over a fairly steep cliff and into a creek, resulting in traumatic injury. The running water they landed in may also be the most probable cause of their tissue decomposition, which explains Dubinina and Zolotaryev's missing features. This proposed version of events has not gone unchallenged, though. While recent research seems to indicate that an avalanche may have been technically possible at the 4 bodies discovery site, the slope and terrain of the mountain would have made such an event highly improbable. This fact alone has been sufficient for other curious individuals to cast doubt on this narrative and to propose a few more malevolent substitutes. One of the most popular alternative theories posits that the aforementioned Mansi tribe had murdered the 4 individuals. In this reality, the absent bodily organs are thought to have been taken by the indigenous men for some sort of ritualistic purpose. While this explanation may seem plausible at first, it has already crumbled under the scrutiny of contemporary investigators who found no evidence of anyone approaching the tent at Dyatlov Pass. The Mansi also had an extremely peaceful reputation, and even if they hadn't, the injuries suffered by the hikers were so forceful that no human being could have caused them. Nor are they consistent with an attack by a wild animal or yeti, as some others have alleged. But what about a nuclear attack? In this wild and borderline conspiratorial story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, proponents claim that the Soviet Union had been testing parachute mines over Dead Mountain on the night of the hikers' deaths. The resulting explosions had woken them, caused them to flee, and subsequently killed them when one of the mines detonated in the air close enough to their location. But to be fair, this story is not without its merits. There is evidence that the USSR had conducted mine tests in the approximate area that the hikers found themselves, though no evidence has yet surfaced which shows definitively that they had conducted such tests on the night of February 1st. Furthermore, clothing found on a few of the hikers was found to be significantly more radioactive than expected, and injuries caused by parachute mines are similar to those sustained by the Dyatlov Pass group. And then there are the details that this account fails to explain. If the hikers had been awoken by bomb explosions, then why do their footsteps appear to show that they had calmly descended the mountainside? If nuclear fallout had caused some of the hikers' clothing to become radioactive, why was every article of clothing not found to be producing such disintegrations? And perhaps most damningly, if the detonation of mines was strong enough to kill several members of the group, why was the surrounding terrain not more significantly disturbed? Ultimately, none of these theories is completely immune to skepticism. Each of them have their strengths, their weaknesses, and raise their own specific questions. The trouble is, further evidence in a case this old is unlikely to reveal itself, and if it does, it may take years or even decades to come forward. As such, we may never know the exact story of how 9 experienced outdoorsmen met their end at Dyatlov Pass in 1959. Whichever retelling you believe most will depend upon your own examination of the evidence, a careful consideration of pros and cons, and more than likely a gut feeling of which sounds the most plausible. So, what do you think? Why did the Dyatlov Pass hikers initially leave their tent? What caused them to venture out into the snow in a state of undress? And what ultimately caused their untimely demise? Let us know in the comments. For more historical content, drop a like and subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you for watching Historian's Corner.